Chapter 15: The Survivor and the Holocaust in the early 1960s. Bruno Bettelheim spoke at Hillel House, the Jewish Center on the University of Chicago campus, where in the 1940s he had lectured his listeners on their duty to assimilate. This subject is packed. For several years, he had criticized the Jews of Europe for their passivity in the face of the Nazi threat, and in recent months he had turned up the volume of this indictment, first in the Informed Heart and then in the Jewish Review midstream, where he maintained that the Jews had cooperated in their own destruction because centuries of ghetto thinking had conditioned them to bow down to the mujik who pulls one's beard, laugh with the baron at his anti-Semitic stories, degrade oneself so that one will be permitted to survive. Superscript 1 in both the review and the book, and in an excerpt from the latter in Harper's. He had cited Otto Frank's decision to hide his family together in Amsterdam as a prime example of ghetto thinking, and had also castigated Frank for not obtaining a gun or two so he could have shot down at least one or two of the police when they came to arrest him and his family. Squared much of the audience at Hillel House that Sunday afternoon arrived angry. And when Bettelheim began reiterating his ghetto thinking accusation, the hostility grew palpable. What galled many was not just his denigration of the victims but his smug, look I got out tone. Both students and faculty members lined up to attack him when he finished speaking, and one professor, Hans Zeisel, seemed ready to assault him physically. Zeisel was 2 years younger than Bettelheim and had also grown up in Vienna, where he became a lawyer and a leading socialist until the Nazis drove him out in 1938. A respected theologist and legal scholar, he had been at the University of Chicago since 1952. Despite his fury, he tried to explain why meaningful opposition to the Nazis had been almost impossible. He told of how in the days after the Anschluss many Jews, including a friend named Kate Lecter, did not sleep at their own homes for fear that the Gestapo would come and arrest them. In Lecter's case, the Gestapo went to her mother's house instead. When told the daughter was not there, they said they would wait. Soon Lecter called to ask how her mother was faring, and the Gestapo came to the phone and told her that unless she turned herself in she would never see her mother again. She came, was arrested, and some time later was executed during a transport from one concentration camp to another. Cubed Bettelheim stuck to his position, as he had in the past, when recounting the frostbite story and other tales of his camp behavior. He held himself up to who understood his adversary, who, unencumbered by ghetto thinking, he had revealed in the Informed Heart that he had made payoffs in the camps to get soft work assignments. But he had not written about how his High Park neighbors Gerhard and Maria Peers had helped pass money to the Nazis on his behalf from Switzerland in 1939. Or of the critical roles Agnes Peel-Crane and the State Department had played in pushing for his release and facilitating his immigration. Rather than disclose these facts, he was inclined, in conversation, at least, to make Eleanor Roosevelt and Herbert Lehman the key players in his rescue. This exaggeration only fueled the rumors about how he had survived in the camps and managed his liberation, stories that had circulated for years in Chicago's emigre community, of which the Pierces were prominent members. Edward Lewinsky, a professor of Renaissance music at the university, was one German refugee who had heard the reports. His parents had been murdered by the Nazis, and he came down on Bettelheim with such rage that some feared he would have a heart attack. He thrust himself into the speaker's face and shouted that he knew his story, knew that he had been freed from Buchenwald before the war had even begun, knew that he had been able to bribe camp officials when so many others had not, knew that influential people in the United States had helped him obtain a visa. Others echoed this cry, including Hans Zeisel, who told Bettelheim that if he continued to stand there and dishonor the Jews who had died in the Holocaust, Zeisel would reveal to everyone in the room how he had gotten out of Buchenwald. It is unlikely that Zeisel could have done this, since Bettelheim himself probably never acquired a clear understanding of all the forces that had combined to free him. But the mere possibility that Zeisel knew and was about to reveal information that Bettelheim wanted kept from the public ear and did the former it. He began to tremble and talk in a cracked voice. He was very upset, recalled Benson Ginsberg, the geneticist who, on the phone a few years later with Bernard Rinland in Palo Alto, would be dismayed by Bettelheim's cruel dismissal of the woman pleading that he take her autistic daughter into his school. As Zeisel bored with unrelenting moral outrage, his target became so shaken that Ginsberg and his wife left. The scene was just too uncomfortable to watch, he told me. Mel Pekarsky, whose husband, Rabbi Maurice Pekarsky, had founded Chicago's Hillel House in 1940 and was its director, said the room just throbbed with anti-Bettelheim feeling. Ultimately, Hans Morgenthau interceded in the debate and managed to help restore a modicum of peace, but the collision reverberated on campus for days. Zeisel told Ginsberg that he knew Bettelheim had been ransomed out of Buchenwald and that Ivy had depicted it in his lectern. At the time of Bettelheim's Hillel House confrontation, one other prominent writer, Raoul Hilberg, had advanced the Jewish passivity argument, albeit in a far less accusatory tone. In his 3-volume The Destruction of the European Jews, in which he used German documents to chart the Nazi killing bureaucracy, he devoted 8 pages at the end of the work to the victims. He maintained that most Jews tried to avoid action, and when that strategy failed they automatically followed their enemy's orders. Their hope was founded on a 2,000-year-old experience, he wrote. In exile the Jews had always been a minority. They had always been in danger. But they had learned that they could avert danger and survive destruction by placating and appeasing their enemies. Jews had endured the Crusades, the Cossacks, the Tsarist persecution. These pogroms had brought great pain and death, but the Jewish communities always had emerged again rock from a receding tidal wave. This experience was so ingrained in the Jewish consciousness as to achieve the force of law. The Jewish people could not be annihilated. When Hilberg published those words in 1961, the historiography of the Holocaust was still undeveloped. But as it became more sophisticated, critics would argue that Hilberg's thesis was seriously flawed because his book was based on Nazi archives to the almost total exclusion of Jewish documents. Such documents, as Lucy de Wijdevich and others have noted, reveal that thousands of Jews resisted the Nazis in ways large and small, always against impossible odds. Of both Hilberg and Bettelheim, de Wijdevich wrote, neither was familiar with Jewish history or Jewish traditional life and culture. Neither understood the historian's craft in terms of critical analysis of sources and exploration of complex interacting causal factors. In the 1960s, critics of Hilberg and Bettelheim often made a blanket indictment that included Hannah Arendt. She seemed to share their passivity argument when she made the questionable charge, in Eichmann in Jerusalem, that wherever Jews lived, there were recognized Jewish leaders, and this leadership, almost without exception, cooperated in one way or another, for one reason or another, with the Nazis. In fact, she did not single out the Jews for their failure to resist the Nazis. Rather, she pointed out in the book that no non-Jewish group or people had behaved differently. She made this same observation in a direct response to Bettelheim's Ghetto Thinking article in Midstream. There is an abundance of evidence, she wrote, which proves beyond a doubt that under extermination camp conditions all groups, social and ethnic, behaved. Mr. Bettelheim looks for a Jewish problem where it doesn't exist. Superscript 1 that Bettelheim loudly insisted that it was a Jewish problem is central to the denial that characterized his writing and speaking on the Holocaust for most of his life, not least in his resistance to letting other views about the concentration camps impinge on his own. In Individual and Mass Behavior in Extreme Situations, he had written that he was offering a preliminary report, one that did not pretend to be exhaustive. Superscript 1 he could hardly have done otherwise. When he was setting down his reflections in the months after his release from Buchenwald in 1939, only a trickle of other testimony existed with which he might have compared his own trial. Information not easily available to a traumatized Viennese refugee who found himself sitting up late in a strange backwater called Rockford, Illinois, struggling to make sense of what had happened to him. Even by the time he published his essay, in 1943, no significant body of literature about the camps had accumulated. And the true evil of the Holocaust itself was only beginning to come into grainy focus for the world outside the Third Reich. But millions of words and pictures would soon start to pour forth documenting the European cataclysm, leaving Bettelheim with a unique opportunity to deepen his original report. An intellectual and emotional enterprise that might well have helped him work through some of the shame and guilt that plagued him. Instead of rethinking and modifying extreme situations, as new details and analysis became available during the late 1940s and into the 1950s, he recycled the essay, in politics. Superscript 1 squared in the Encyclopedia Britannica, Superscript 1 cubed in Basic Values and Human Relationships, Superscript 1 in Readings in Social Psychology, Superscript 1 among other places. With each reprinting, his claims, generalities, and judgments hardened into received truth for a wider audience. He had interviewed 1,500 fellow inmates during his 10.5 months of incarceration. He had found that most of them had reverted to childlike behavior after a short time in the camps. Many had aped the guards to the point of copying their uniforms. And they had proved, by 1960, himself as an expert. When he republished most of Extreme Situations, yet again that year in The Informed Heart, he assured his readers that he had studied the problem of the German concentration camps since they were first established, years before he became a prisoner. Superscript 1 Bettelheim wrote that his new book offered a much enlarged discussion of his camp experience, one that drew on the observations of others. Superscript 1 for the most part, however, he ignored works that concentrated on what from the beginning he said most concerned him: the psychological impact of the camp experience. In 1948, his barracks mate Ernst Federn had written The Terror as a System, an article about his 7 years in Buchenwald. He observed that most of the imprisoned Jews had, contrary to Bettelheim's view in Extreme Situations, revealed remarkable tenacity and ingenuity, proving that human beings preserve their characters even in the greatest distress. Superscript 1 Bettelheim mentioned Federn's report en passant in a note, Superscript 1, but did not deal with its contents, which included almost 5 pages on camp psychology. Squared in 1946, Federn had mailed a draft of his article to Bettelheim, who urged him to rethink the piece because it was too ambitious and marked by uneven and redundant writing. Squared Superscript 1, as already noted, in 1950 Bettelheim reviewed Searchlights on Delinquency, a collection of psychoanalytic studies in which he came across Edith Jacobson's clinical investigation of women political prisoners. A doctor and psychoanalyst trained in Munich and Berlin, Jacobson was jailed for 2 years before the war because she refused to tell the Gestapo about her patients. She was confined with about 100 other women aged 20 to 60 in Nazi state prisons, not concentration camps, but fearsome cages nonetheless. She found her fellow inmates generally cooperative. Women who, despite their desperate situation, tried to understand and to help each other over their unhappiness and to control the irritability so common to collective confinement. What in World War I had been called the barbed wire disease. Squared Bettelheim had not addressed Jacobson's study when he reviewed Searchlights, and he did not mention it in The Informed Heart. Nor did he refer to Ellie Cohen's human behavior in the concentration camp, at the time the most comprehensive exploration of camp psychology. A Dutch psychologist, Cohen was betrayed when he tried to escape to Sweden. He spent 3 years in the camps, including Auschwitz, where his book, published in 1950, devotes more than half of its 302 pages to a considered examination of the psychological behavior of both the prisoners and the SS. An exploration referenced to a bibliography of 157 entries, including Extreme Situations. Cohen, like Jacobson and Federn, did not share that essay's pessimistic and patronizing view of prisoner behavior. though he had come through a far more harrowing hell than Bettelheim had. What he saw in Auschwitz convinced him that the human power of adaptation, both physical and mental, was much greater than he had ever thought possible. Squared Cube Viktor Frankl, too, suffered much worse than Bettelheim. His mother, father, brother, and wife died in the camps, and he himself went through the agony of Auschwitz. After the Viennese psychiatrist and neurologist was liberated in 1945, he wrote a moving essay about his experience that, coupled with an explanation of the existential treatment philosophy he had developed called logotherapy, would eventually appear in 20 languages and reach several million readers. Frankl's portrait of his fellow prisoners' behavior is at once clear-eyed and sympathetic. He wrote that there were enough examples, often of a heroic nature, which proved that apathy could be overcome, irritability suppressed. Man can preserve a vestige of spiritual freedom, of independence of mind, even in such terrible conditions of psychic and physical stress. Squared Frankl's book was not published in English until 1959. Under the title From Death Camp to Existentialism, A Psychiatrist's Path to a New Therapy, Squared, this translation probably appeared too late for Bettelheim to consult it when writing The Informed Heart. But the original version in his native tongue, Ein Psychologe das Konzentrationslager, a psychologist experiences the concentration camp, was widely known, especially among survivors, and had been available since 1946. Squared Bettelheim made no reference to the book in The Informed Heart, even in a bibliography, for which he saw no need. When he did mine works on the camps that had appeared since Extreme Situations, it was often for anecdotes he felt buttressed his own views, not least his passivity allegation. One author he cited frequently in The Informed Heart was Eugen Kogon, the economist and journalist who emerged from 7 years in Buchenwald to write The Theory and Practice of Hell, widely regarded as a classic examination of the camp system. Kogon told of an SS officer who made a woman dancer perform naked as she faced death in the gas chamber. She obeyed his command and somehow managed to get close enough to seize his gun and shoot him. Isn't it probable, Bettelheim asked, dancing made her once again a person? In his admiring view, she had been momentarily transformed into her old self and had destroyed the enemy. She had been willing to risk her life to achieve a last moment of autonomy. If we do that, then if we cannot live, at least we die as men. Squared. The millions of European Jews who had not escaped or gone underground should have behaved like the dancer. Should have confronted the SS whatever the risk. Instead, they first groveled, then waited to be rounded up for extermination, and finally walked themselves to the gas chambers. Bettelheim contrasted this behavior to the stand of heroic blacks in South Africa in the 1950s. Hundreds of them had died marching against the guns of apartheid, and thousands more had been sent to concentration camps. But Bettelheim was confident that their brave fight would eventually lead to liberty. In predicting this new dawn, he did not bother to observe that the country's blacks and coloreds were not being herded into ovens, or that they outnumbered their white tormentors 4-1. Whereas the Jews had been a tiny minority drowning in a vast sea of Third Reich Gentiles. Squared. Bettelheim's praise for South Africa's blacks was more than a little disingenuous. He viewed the country's whites as an oppressed minority like the Jews, and more than once said that despite apartheid the white government wasn't so bad, because it had created the highest living standard in Africa. Square. To illustrate how spineless Jewish prisoners had been, Bettelheim wrote that on occasions a mere 2 guards would be herding some 400 prisoners over lonesome roads toward their death in an extermination camp. He conceded that a few prisoners would have been killed had the 400 attacked the duo, but assured his readers that the majority would have escaped to join partisan groups. He did not describe the terrain the lonesome roads covered, the camp or camps they were near, the condition of the prisoners, or how he knew that the ratio was 200-1. But, to shore up his point, he wrote that Rudolf Haas had also wondered, in his memoirs, why the Jewish prisoners had not revolted, since they could have done so easily. QD did not cite the page in Haas's Kommandant in Auschwitz where this speculation could be found, and in fact it appears nowhere in the book. Cube superscript 1 was well known by the late 1950s, when Bettelheim was writing The Informed Heart. Jews were not transported to Auschwitz and the other killing factories over lonesome roads but on well-guarded trains. Nor was Europe teeming with partisan organizations, especially harsh Holocaust scholar Jacob Robinson has noted, anti-Semitic, or at best indifferent to Jews. Even the rare group friendly to Jews would have been cautious about taking any in, especially weak and emaciated escapees, whose presence would only have heightened the risk of exposure in a hostile local community, and who did not bring any weapons with them. Cube Squared Bettelheim did not address the matter of weapons in his Lonesome Roads anecdote. But in offering the experience of Otto Frank and his family as his paradigm of ghetto thinking, he wrote that there is little doubt that the Franks, who were able to provide themselves with so much, could have provided themselves with a gun or two had they wished. Thus, they could have killed at least one or two of the police who came to arrest them in their Amsterdam.
Hideout. There was no surplus of such police, Bettelheim argued. The loss of an SS with every Jew arrested would have noticeably hindered the functioning of the police state. Besides, had the Franks heroically shot down one or two of the men who came for them, their fate would not have been much different. Since all the family but Otto died anyway, at least they could have sold their lives dearly instead of walking to their death. Superscript 3, and yet it need not have come to that. Had Otto Frank been willing to break up his family Hyde and her sister, Marg, separately, he would have greatly increased their chance of survival. He did not do this, Bettelheim wrote, because he and his wife insisted on going about business as usual. He maintained that Anne Frank died because her parents could not get themselves to believe in Auschwitz. Superscript 3 and that the universal acclaim for her diary was symptomatic of the same denial. The doomed Anne's moving record of life in hiding above her father's food products business on the Prinsengracht Canal encouraged millions of readers to forget the gas chambers and to glorify attitudes of extreme privatization, of continuing to hold on to attitudes as usual even in the Holocaust. Superscript 3 he wrote that this exaltation of Anne's passive suffering suggested that the Jews should have remained slaves of Egypt rather than defy Pharaoh and set out to create a new society, a new world of human experience, of law, of the dignity of man. Superscript 3 broadcast these attacks widely, and not just for adults. Margot Jefferson, the New York Times book and theater critic in the 1990s, was a freshman at the lab school in 1961 when he came to her English class with his rebuke. What I remember best, she told me, is the gleeful but lofty pleasure he took in mocking Otto Frank for not getting the family out, and for letting them worry. In Superscript 3 when the non-television Bettelheim required that the orthogenic school children watch and then discuss it with their counselors, after which he talked about it at one of the 3 o'clock meetings that regularly took place in the basement playroom. I found the film heartrending, recalled Ronald Grace, who was about 8 years old when he saw it. However, the politically correct opinion at the school at the time was, boy, were the Franks stupid not to fight back. I was totally unprepared for that. Grace told me that Bettelheim exuded a kind of anti-Brovialized message about Jews hanging on to their possessions. The implication being that what happened to them was sort of poetic justice. The film, and the hit play that preceded it, both written by the Broadway and Hollywood team of Francis Goodrich and Albert Hackett, especially angered Bettelheim, because they stressed and commercialized even more than the bookhand's belief that despite her family's experience people were really good at heart. Superscript 3 he maintained that this message debased the Holocaust. Because if all men were good then Auschwitz could not possibly have happened. Superscript 3 others shared his disdain, among them Anna Arendt, who felt that the admiration for Anne Frank, especially in Germany, was phony and that the whole business was highly unpleasant, cheap sentimentality at the expense of a great catastrophe. 4 degrees the novelist Meyer Levin, who remained Peter all his life because his own stage adaptation of the diary was rejected in 1952, felt Goodrich and Hackett had sanitized the book, had given the world the saintly every child, a symbol of the abstract evils of prejudice rather than the young girl, and was the victim murdered like 6 million others because she was Jewish. For superscript 1, these criticisms have some merit. But the claim to know what millions around the world took away from the play, film, and book was tinged with more than a little intellectual arrogance, as was Bettelheim's insistence that the enormity of the Holocaust was necessarily diluted by the optimistic and humane outlook of an uncynical teenager who, in fact, did not know about Auschwitz. More arrogant still was his refusal to let the facts intrude on his denunciation of the Franks. His blithe assurance that Otto Frank could have picked up guns as easily as tulips in Amsterdam with ruthless Nazi occupiers on every corner and informers everywhere is the stuff of fairy tales. Just as fantastic was the notion that Jews could have put the SS and local police on the defensive had they just been brave and imaginative enough to find ways to kill them. On the night of February 19th, 1941, some 15 months before the Franks went into hiding, Dutch partisans raided the Nazi security station in a neighborhood where many Jews lived. 3 nights later, this court all arrested at random and transported first to Buchenwald and other camps, where all but one of the rest perished. Not surprisingly, this reprisal had a paralyzing impact on all Jews in the Netherlands. For superscript 2, those Holland's Jews were more severely affected than those in any other occupied country. An estimated 18,000, including 4,500 children, managed to survive the war in hiding. For superscript 3, by early August 1944, the Franks had remained safe in their annex for more than 2 years and had every reason to hope that their ordeal might soon be over. As they knew from their radio, the Allies had invaded Normandy 2 months before and were advancing rapidly across Europe. When the family was arrested on August 4 after being betrayed, the liberation of Paris was only 3 weeks away. Brussels was liberated on September 3, the day the Nazis sent their last transport from the Jewish transit camp at Westerbork to Auschwitz. Otto, Edith, Mark, and Anne Frank were on that train. 44 Bettelheim provided none of this context in the informed heart. Instead, he reproached the Franks for never trying to make their way to freedom so they could fight their executioners. 45. Jacob Robinson called the notion of the Franks battling the Nazis and the mill simply silly. 46, and it would be were it not so cruel to their memory. Most telling in Bettelheim's attack was his failure to mention that Otto Frank had not been passive when Hitler came to power in 1933. He had read the future of Germany's Jews correctly and immediately moved his family to Amsterdam from their comfortable home in Frankfurt. Bettelheim had waited 5 more years without acting, despite the cautionary headlines emanating daily from Germany and the lethal growth of fascism in Austria, despite the emigration of his friend Fritz Riddle in 1936 and of his cousin Edith Buxbaum the following year. And despite Agnes P.O. Crane's repeated and increasingly urgent pleas that he and Gina bring Patsy home and resettle in the United States. As the Anschluss loomed, Bettelheim had pursued his degree at the University of Vienna, tended to and even expanded his lumber enterprise, cared for his mother and sister, coped with a failing marriage, and continued his affair with Trude Weinfeld. He wrote in the informed heart that he had asked hundreds of German Jewish prisoners in Buchenwald why the Nazi terror had not moved them to flee their homeland before it was too late. Their answer was, "How could we leave? It would have meant giving up our homes, our places of business." He left no doubt that these Jews and others who got trapped in the Holocaust, including the Franks, had been foolish to allow their earthly possessions to take such hold of them. 47 However uniquely his survey, Bettelheim was right that many Jews in the businesses, homes, and belongings had he was one. When the Nazis invaded Vienna in mid-March of 1938, he stayed in the city instead of trying to escape with Gina and Patsy, in part because of his concern for the fate of Bettelheim and Schnitzer and the income it produced. Even after his incarceration, he used precious space in his limited letters to discuss his business affairs. He worried, too, about what to do with the furniture and cabinets at Gloria Tegese 15, and told his mother to make sure to pick up the overcoat and the 6 sets of shirts and pants he had ordered before his arrest. Bettelheim devoted the first third of the informed heart to an essay on the importance of maintaining one's autonomy in a mass age. The subtitle he gave the book, he saw modern technology as a mixed blessing. providing dishwashers, but also imposing the growing uniformity that stifled individuality in a way that invited dictatorship. He urged his readers to make a deeper commitment to human relations to combat the increasingly mechanized and repressive world around them. 48 by 1960, such concerns, though certainly valid, were, as one critic put it, slightly shop-worn. For the threat posed by mass society had been a recurrent theme among leftist intellectuals since the 1920s, not least Max Horkheimer, Theodore Adorno, and other members of the Frankfurt School. The central feature of the school's critical theory was its attempt to address modern authoritarianism, and after the war Adorno explored the subject in The Authoritarian Personality. This became the most popular book in the American Jewish Committee's Studies and Prejudice series, of which Horkheimer was co-editor, and for which Bettelheim wrote Dynamics of Prejudice with Morris Yanowitz. Among others who had raised the alarm word, most famously, Hannah Arendt, in The Origins of Totalitarianism, and David Reisman, in The Lonely Crowd. Bettelheim acknowledged the influence of his Chicago colleague Reisman but added little to the discussion. Mark Lubin, who took graduate courses with Bettelheim at Chicago and worked at the Orthogenic School, recalled reading The Informed Heart as an undergraduate at Brandeis University. At the time I thought he was a kind of minor league plain PR. The stuff about mechanized society seemed kind of dry to me, because that's all we were talking about back then. Yet Bettelheim's focus on the importance of autonomy reveals, along with much else in the book, how he was grappling with the dark memory of his own crushed autonomy. For too long, he had also gone about business as usual and hoped for the best. He, too, had not gotten the gun. Beneath his shouts of blame, he occasionally whispered that one failure to fight back was altogether false when the SS forced prisoners to stand for open resistance was impossible. As impossible as it was to do anything definite to safeguard oneself. 5 degrees. What happened in the concentration camp showed that the influence of the environment over the individual can become total. 5 superscript 1 and that no really successful defense was possible. 5 superscript 2 1 was in the hands of the enemy and powerless to do anything about it. 5 superscript 3 as early as 1945, he had asked, where is there the people whose average citizen is a hero? 54 he reiterated the point in The Informed Heart. 55 and by 1963 was writing, in a review of Aaron Eichmann in Jerusalem, that most people are neither heroes nor martyrs. 56 that only the extraordinary person, at great risk to himself, could retain limited freedom in a fascist state like Hitler's. 57 Bettelheim was explaining why Eichmann had not resisted his orders to engineer the final solution, but he could not extend such mitigation to the dutiful bureaucrats praised. In observing that heroism was rare among average citizens, he was writing not about the Jews but about the German citizenry's failure to oppose the Nazis actively, and in tones of understanding, not blame. He had manifested such empathy early on, writing in 1945 that in order to survive, the average German did what everyone would do in the same circumstance, tried to suppress all thoughts of the terror around him. 58 the following year, he complained to Ernst Federn of former Jewish inmates who could not be objective about their camp experience. Again and again. Only the fate of the Jews is bemoaned. As if no German Aryan prisoners had ever been in the concentration camps. 5 to Bettelheim, every German had in some way or other been an inmate of that wider concentration camp which was the Third Reich. Every German who lived under the Nazi regime, whether he accepted or fought it, had been through a concentration camp in a sense. Some, the actual inmates, had gone through it as tortured slaves. Others, the majority of Germans, had gone through it as trustees, so to speak. This passage appeared in Reflections Bettelheim set down in commentary after visiting Dachau in 1955. 6 degrees, an essay that throws a spotlight into the depths of his denial. He wrote it during the summer of 1955, while he was teaching at the University of Frankfurt. The German intellectual showed him a newspaper clip he had been carrying for 2 years. The article described how a visitor to Dachau had been told by his German guide that only criminals had been incarcerated at the camp and that no torture had been inflicted there. Bettelheim was struck by the intellectual's carrying the clipping for so long in his breast pocket, over his heart, as it were, suggesting to the former that this would get the concentration camps. Fromm said that this encounter helped persuade him to return to Dachau. where he found a cab driver eager to give him a tour. He named neither the intellectual nor the driver, which gives his account a whiff of as if, but, however much of the scenario may be invented, the message is clear. Bettelheim wrote that he did not reveal that he had been a prisoner but told the driver he had come to learn the truth about the camp because he had heard that people exaggerated what had gone on there. To his surprise, the driver said it was impossible to overstate the horrors. He had been a young resident of the village when Bettelheim was an inmate and had witnessed the killings and callous ferocity of the SS. He described incidents Bettelheim said he had witnessed himself, though the author supplied no specifics. The driver complained that the SS had taken over the local taverns, monopolized the girls, and made it impossible for him and his friends to talk openly. He was also furious that Hitler had located the camp outside his hometown, which had acquired such a bad name that whenever he was away he preferred not to say where he lived. Bettelheim found remarkable the equanimity with which the driver faced the truth about Dachau, but soon had his explanation. It turned out that the driver had spent for years in Siberia as a prisoner of war. This German had suffered under Hitler, so he felt just as much as those in Hitler's concentration camps had. So he felt free of guilt. Bettelheim credited the driver with having worked through the reality of the camp so that he no longer needed to deny it. 6 superscript to Bettelheim, however, balked at looking too hard. The U.S. military now commanded the camp, which housed refugees, and some of the area was off limits, a fact the driver regretted because it crimped his tour. His passenger wrote that he probably could have obtained permission to make a closer inspection, but it seemed pointless. They did manage to drive along the main street of the camp, and Bettelheim was tempted to get out when they approached the barrack where he had lived for 3.5 months in 1938. But children played on the once forbidding ground, and he decided not to disturb them for the sake of what by now was empty curiosity. 6 superscript 3 He had arrived at Dachau angry, in part because two clerks at his hotel in Munich had dismissed the importance of the camp and had discouraged his visit. But the displaced persons who now inhabited the barracks and the reassuring presence of U.S. soldiers had quieted his rage. It was no use beating the dead dog, even though when alive it had mauled, maimed, and killed. Everything seemed to belong to a remote past. Even the tourist graffiti on the crematorium aroused no more than a mild disgust in him. 64 The crematorium was in a small grove that served as a memorial, in a striped uniform, and Bettelheim wrote that at first he was oppressed by the smallness of the area, standing amid the well-kept flower beds. He found it hard to imagine that thousands of prisoners had gone through terrible degradation and deaths at Dachau. 65 Yet he wondered whether Americans would have behaved any differently had they been vanquished. Their cities in ruins and victorious foreigners stationed throughout the country. By the end of his reflections, he was suggesting that the Germans had been wise to commemorate their Nazi history by confining it to an ever smaller place. We cannot expect present-day Germans to have a much different attitude toward their victims than they have toward their own devastated cities, since they are much more matter-of-fact about the ruins of their own homes than I am. I must accept their being more matter-of-fact about Dachau. 66 By the time The Informed Heart appeared in 1960, Bettelheim's willingness to understand the Germans and his angry criticism of their victims had become the two sides of his Holocaust coin. Yet few who reviewed the book remarked on this unique minting and the denial is represented. Almost without exception, the public critical reaction to the book was favorable. Franz Alexander, the Hungarian-born psychoanalyst who had founded the Chicago Institute in 1932, praised Bettelheim's unusual amount of objectivity and detachment. 67 The New Statesman said the book seemed lit from within by a humanist glow. 68 Neither they nor virtually anyone else who assessed the Informed Heart in print addressed the author's attack on Otto Frank and Anne Spirey, or even raised the subject. When Studs Terkel did introduce the topic during a talk with Bettelheim on his popular Chicago radio program, his guest said the Franks were exactly like the passengers on the Titanic who had not entered the lifeboats because they had to go down to get a fur coat or some diamond bracelets left in the cabin. Terkel, deferential throughout the interview, Let the remark pass. 6. The major reason Turkel and so many others failed to look harder at Bettelheim's Holocaust writing is encapsulated in George Steiner's reaction to The Informed Heart. The literary critic and cultural journalist was dazzled by the book. He felt the former inmate had brought to the reality of the concentration camp the remarkable discipline of insight, and wrote the fiction falls silent before the enormity of the fact, and before the vivid authority with which that fact can be rendered by unadorned report. 7 degrees that extreme situations and its permutations up through The Informed Heart might not be unadorned reports was something Steiner and thousands of other readers were not inclined to consider. Bettelheim had been there, they had not. He had gone through the terror of the camps and then the crucible of writing. What he said about such a yearning that Bettelheim's description of life in Dachau and Buchenwald was full of questionable generalities, invented research, lit psychology, and a good deal of fiction, which instead of falling silent before the enormity of fact noisily obfuscated it. Yet, because he was the first person in the United States to stake a public claim to the Holocaust territory, because he wrote with such vivid authority, because his reputation carried all before it, and, most of all, because he was a victim, he was sheltered from exposure, like prisoner 9036 in the sock mending shop at Buchenwald. This public wall of protection would remain largely unbreached until 1976, when Terence Depress, an English professor at Colgate University, published The Survivor, An Anatomy of Life in the Death Camps. Depress, who died in 1987, was an American born in 1939, but though he had no personal experience of the Holocaust, he was obsessed by it. In the words of a friend, he had been struck by the camp horrors into permanent grief. 7 Superscript 1. This grief is apparent on almost every page of The Survivor, but so is an articulate and unflinching scholarship, and together they gained the author a wide audience and much critical praise. Alfred Kazin wrote that Depress had shed badly needed light on how well some people behaved in hell. 7 Superscript 2. He did this by analyzing fictional treatments of the Holocaust, interviewing a number of survivors, and closely examining the written testimony of 71 others, including individual and mass behavior in extreme situations and The Informed Heart. Depress found Bettelheim's assessments of camp life and its larger meaning seriously flawed. In particular, he criticized Bettelheim's belief, shared by Cohen and others, that psychoanalysis could play a useful role in understanding prisoner behavior. He argued that psychoanalysis was essentially a theory of culture and in the civilized state. Its analytic power, which is considerable, is maximized when turned upon behavior which is symbolic, mediated, and therefore at a sufficient remove from necessity. The psychoanalytic method was one of interpretation. To be effective, it had to be applied to actions that had more than one meaning on the level of meaning. Depress maintained that this was not the case in the camps, where prisoners had to respond to direct necessity under terrifying intimidation. In such a situation, behavior has no meaning at all in a symbolic or psychological sense. The survivors' experiences had to be seen in their own terms. By applying the psychoanalytic model, Bettelheim had done more harm than good. Because replays had gone unchallenged for so long of psychoanalysis as a tool for interpreting camp experience, Depress attacked Bettelheim's central thesis, that most prisoners reverted to childlike behavior. Yes, he wrote, inmates were obsessed with their excretory functions, as Bettelheim and many others reported, but it did not follow that this signified a return to infantilism. Depress pointed out that the SS constantly cowed and degraded the inmates by withholding permission to defecate and urinate. He argued that Bettelheim had failed to distinguish between just what he said he was examining behavior in an extreme situation, and civilized behavior, for of course, if in civilized circumstances an adult worries about the state of his bowels, or sees the trip to the toilet as some sort of ordeal, then neurosis is evident. But in the concentration camps, behavior was governed by immediate death threat. Action was not the index of infantile wishes but a response to hideous necessity. 74. Ironically, Bettelheim suggested in The Informed Heart that he well understood this distinction. Though he leaned heavily on psychoanalysis in his critique of camp behavior, he noted its inadequacies as well, primarily the discipline's failure to take environment into greater consideration. He wrote that the camp experience made it clear that we should never again be satisfied to see personality change as proceeding independent from the social context. 75 This was a useful insight, but Bettelheim never followed through on it. Never developed the revised theory of psychoanalysis that drew on social psychology, never assessed inmate behavior through just the lens he was urging others to use. Instead, as Paul Marcus and Alan Rosenberg have pointed out, his camp narratives tend to be Hobbesian-like in that the inmate is viewed more or less like a discrete entity without a social existence. 76 Terence Dipress also faulted Bettelheim for the kind of oversimplification and lack of context that marked so much of his Holocaust writing. In The Informed Heart, he had saluted the men of the 12th Sonderkommando Special Squad, the team of mostly Jews who worked in the gas chambers at Auschwitz. On October 6, 1944, they revolted, blew up the crematorium, and killed some 70 Nazis before breaking through the fence and scattering across the terrain. Most, if not all, were caught and executed, and as Bettelheim himself wrote, all 853 prisoners of the commando died. Bettelheim saw this outcome as evidence that inmates in the Sonderkommandos had a chance of about 10 to 1 to destroy the SS. Given such inbreeding probabilities, he asked, why did millions walk quietly, without resistance, to their death? Dipress did not deal with Bettelheim's remarkable odd factor into the 12th Sonderkommando's singular gas-packed explosives used in the revolt, and that their organization had to be forged and made trustworthy amid constant depletion of members who were killed. 77 Dipress saw Bettelheim's analysis of camp behavior rooted in the old heroic ethic, his praise for the 12th Sonderkommando and for the dancer who shot the SS officer, and his disdain for Jews like the Franks who could not summon up such courage, reflected the belief that heroism is an isolated act of defiance through which the individual as an individual confronts death. To Dipress, the autonomy Bettelheim claimed the dancer achieved before being shot to death was empty, and the act he celebrated was suicide. What can autonomy at the cost of personal destruction amount to? How effective would underground activities, or any of the forms of resistance, have been on such a principle? Bettelheim's argument comes down to this: manhood requires dramatic self-confirmation, and in the camps this could only be achieved through some moment of open confrontation with death. Insofar as the struggle for life did not become overtly rebellious, prisoners were childlike. Dipress also regarded as invalid Bettelheim's comparison of the survivor's experience with the plight of modern man in mass society. He argued that whatever the difficulties and hazards of the homogenizing and manipulative contemporary culture, daily life does not hinge at every moment on the issue of life and death. Pain is not constant. Options abound. The rule of error and necessity is far from total. Life for us does not depend on collective action, not directly, that is, nor is death the price of visibility. Bettelheim wishes to rouse us from our sense of victimhood, but by claiming that pressure reduces men and women to children, and by praising a heroism based on death. He tends instead to support what he fears. 78 No one in the United States had ever attacked Bettelheim on any subject before such a wide audience, and never had his concentration camp views been dissected with such intellectual rigor and force. Least of all by an obscure English professor who had yet to be born when Bettelheim entered Dachau. The critique infuriated Bettelheim. He wrote to Nancy Dayton that some idiot named Terence Dipress had published a book on survivors, and muttered that excerpts were getting big play in Harper's and Descent 7, referring to the latter as a Jewish magazine and implying, in a letter to Carl Frankenstein, that the editors should have known better than to publish such pernicious thinking. He told his Israeli friend that Dipress was subtly preaching fascism and depicting the survivor as Superman. In passing, he wrote, Dipress attacked me ally, but this is beside the point. 8 degrees that it was precisely the point. Bettelheim would soon make clear. Such controversy swirled around Seven Beauties, filmed about Pasqualino, a small-time Neapolitan mafioso and lady killer who finds himself in a German concentration camp. To some, this black comedy offered the most frightening vision of hell ever put on film. 8 superscript 1 It had propelled War Tumblr into the highest regions of cinematic art. 8 superscript 2 Two others. The movie was a grotesque vaudeville show and its box office success a triumph of insensitivity. 8 superscript 3 Bettelheim viewed the film at the request of the New York Times, found it appalling, and sat down in a white heat to demolish it. His article ultimately appeared in the New Yorker, possibly because he missed the Times deadline or because the piece at some 20,000 words ran too long for the newspaper. He believed that Tumblr consciously rejected fascism, machismo, and the camp abyss, but that unconsciously she was fascinated by their power, brutality, amorality, their rape of man. He conceded that she had clearly depicted war and the camp hell, but claimed she had made it possible for viewers to deny the horrors, because what we watch is a farce played in the charnel house. Like many others who had been through the camps, and a good number who had not been, Bettelheim was dismayed that scenes of prisoners being hanged or drowned in their own feces could be regarded by the director and her film's enthusiastic audiences as a fit subject for what Time called a death house comedy. That is certainly a fair description of several scenes. Chief among them the desperate seduction by Pasqualino of the camp commandant, the piggish, booted woman modeled on Ilse Carr, the bitch of Buchenwald. She tells the desperate, starving prisoner that sexual failure will mean death, and when he does not fail she makes him a block leader. Ultimately, Pasqualino not only orders others to their deaths but shoots his best friend to save himself. Bettelheim saw in this portrait a deeply offensive message that survival alone counts, nothing else. 84 This is surely one possible interpretation of Seven Beauties, but the film is deep enough to deserve a more nuanced analysis, which it received in several quarters. However, Bettelheim implied that because he had been in the camps it was the correct reading of the movie. He was back at the fiery and frank. That memoir had helped its audiences avert their eyes from the facts of camp life because it was optimistic and sentimental. Werther's dark comic approach likewise blinded her viewers. Bettelheim seemed unwilling or unable to ask the logical questions here. Why did the fiery and Werther's film touch so many people? Were these millions all necessarily turning away from the Holocaust? Nor was he willing to struggle in print with the possibility that he was the one averting his gaze, that in angrily denouncing Pasqualino's cruel opportunism he was to self-serving behavior in Dachau and Buchenwald, claimed intellectual who was unable to grant that the subject of survival, in the camps or in general, defied easy answers and needed to be approached with a good deal of care and humility. Terence Dippress had done just that in The Survivor. But now Bettelheim did the opposite, dragging the upstart professor into his Seven Beauties indictment like a furious teacher taking an insolent student to the handiest woodshed. He lashed Dippress with the accusation that he, like Werther, believed that survival at any cost was all that mattered, and charged the author with presenting a small segment of the truth and claiming it was the entire spectrum, thus promulgating a much greater distortion than an outright lie. 85 In fact, it was Bettelheim who stood astride Dippress with the whip of mendacity. He made no effort to address the considerable research and serious analysis that Dippress had painstakingly laid out. Nowhere in his 20,000 words did he discuss the younger man's treatment of fictional accounts of the Holocaust, his interviews with survivors, or his textual study of the testimonies of the 71 victims, including Primo Levi, Eugen Kogon, and Elie Wiesel. Bettelheim also saw no need to inform his readers that his own testimonies indicated and mass behavior in extreme situations, and the informed heart had been sharply criticized by the president. In his final chapter, called Radical Nakedness, Dippress speculated that biology played a central role in the camps, that survival depends on life, ally life, that is, as the biologists see it. Not as a state or condition but as a set of activities evolved through time in successful response to crisis, the sole purpose of which is to keep going. 86 He buttressed this idea with considerable documentation, but set it forth modestly as conjecture only, concluding that for all our achievements and dreams we have not, after all, defeated the body's crude claims, and this, again, is the survivor's special importance. He is the first of civilized men to live beyond the compulsions of culture, beyond the fear of death which can only be assuaged by insisting that life itself is worth less. The survivor is evidence that men and women are now strong enough, mature enough, awake enough, to face death without mediation, and therefore to embrace life without reserve. 87 Bettelheim seized on the phrases the body's crude claims, beyond the compulsions of culture, and embrace life without reserve, and flayed his impudent student with them throughout the article. 88 He maintained To cite two examples, that Pasqualino was living by the buddy's crude claims in achieving an erection for the grotesque commandant. Thus that was the kind of behavior Deprez celebrated in his book, without reserve, by accepting fascism, actions of culture when, as block leader, he handed over other inmates to be killed. Thus Deprez endorsed these actions as well. Deprez supported nothing of the kind, as even a cursory reading of the survivor shows, but it is altogether possible that Bettelheim never read the entire book, since his article cites only the magazine excerpts. Bettelheim's attack was a prime example of his desperate need always to, in his daughter Naomi's words, on top by trying to make the other person look like a fool. He may not have succeeded in making Deprez look like a fool to anyone who read the Colgate professor's work, but he came out indisputably on top. He was the reigning expert on the camps, again making his confident case, this time in the sacred pages of the New Yorker, where respectability and belief were assured, and the magazine's policy of not running letters guaranteed no response, as it had when Clara Claiborne Park tried to redress Peter Gay's Valentine to the empty fortress. Deprez eventually did reply in print, but not until 3 years had passed, and then in Social Research, a quarterly with a circulation of 3,000. In an essay he called The Bettelheim Problem, Deprez noted, among other things, Bettelheim's determination over the years to present the milieu of the orthogenic school as the reverse of the camps. He concluded that the former inmate will look neither right nor left but say what has to be said to keep his world free of intruders. Anyone with whom authority might have to be shared, other survivors' parents, shall be discredited. In the world of the camps, Bettelheim is the only true survivor. In the world of the school he is the only source of adequate care. By constantly crossing these worlds, planting one upon the other, Bettelheim derives an identity which, at least in his own eyes, is much like the mythical just man, the one who shall bear all suffering, the one on whom the existence of the human world depends. 6 months after the New Yorker article appeared, Bettelheim stood once again as the just man before a conference on the Holocaust in San Jose, California. Some 300 people had gathered to hear his address, among them most of the other speakers, including the theologian Robert McAfee Brown and Russell Hilberg, author of The Destruction of the European Jews. Once again, Bettelheim castigated Jews for their denial in the face of the Nazi onslaught, but this time he added a new twist. He said that the words Holocaust and genocide were misnomers that failed to capture the horrors of the camps and permitted a new generation of Jews to dodge the truth, as did the term martyr when applied to the millions who had died. By calling the victims of the Nazis martyrs we falsify their fate, Bettelheim lectured the audience in English dictionary. Defines one daring to renounce his faith. Superscript 1. This exercise in semantics and Bettelheim's like sheep litany enraged several members of the audience. One was Mel Mermelstein, a businessman from Long Beach, California, who told me he had entered Auschwitz as a teenager in 1944. He had seen his mother and his sisters driven into the gas chambers, and he resented not only Bettelheim's victim blaming but his equation of his own incarceration before the war with that of those who suffered and died in the death camps. Before Bettelheim finished speaking, a man in the audience began shouting at him. Precisely what he yelled is inaudible on the tape of the speech, but Bettelheim's response is clear. Whether you want to hear it or not, he shouted back, you are going to hear it. 2 years after the speech, Bettelheim published Surviving and Other Essays. The collection contains several reprints that deal with subjects other than the Holocaust, but the book's title and focus are on the centerpiece essay, the replay of the author's polemic against Lena Erfler and Terence Deprez. 2 decades had passed since he had sat down to write The Informed Heart, and thousands of books and articles had been added to the Holocaust shelf, but he referred to virtually none of this material. Besides recycling Surviving, he again dusted off individual and mass behavior in extreme situations, now 36 years old, and also re-offered readers large swatches of The Informed Heart. Instead of just resupplying a few pages from that book that dealt with the Frank family, he gave a special chapter over to the expanded version of his attack that originally had appeared in Harper's. And he included his San Jose speech, which he called The Holocaust, 1 generation later, a curious title given that he denigrated the word in the text. But, then, He also used the terms Holocaust and genocide throughout the rest of the volume, with apparent equanimity. Superscript to whatever Bettelheim chose to call the murderous events in Europe between 1939 and 1945. Most critics outside the survivor community continued to pay obeisance when he addressed the subject. Almost without exception, the reviews that adhered to surviving were favorable. Paul Robinson wrote in the New York Times book review that among Bettelheim's many virtues were intellectual humility and called him one of the most rigorous of the modern Jewish intellectuals. Superscript 3, an astonishing claim for an author who supplied neither notes nor bibliography in the book under review. Again and again, Bettelheim's testimony on behalf of all survivors was placed on the pedestal of truth. As a victim of the camps, he was an irreproachable witness, a steady voice in a chorus of interpreters. For without doubt, books, the most efficient camps and their aftermath, here Bettelheim speaks with absolute authority. 5.